I know people are still trickling in, but I'm going to kick things off because we have a few items of housekeeping to get through before we get into the findings themselves. First of all, hope everyone's doing all right. Hope you're having a good day so far. Hope you're safe and healthy, of course. On the screen here, you see some housekeeping points. First of all, as always, we want to make sure that you can see and hear everything clearly. So let us know. Let us know if you're having any kind of technical issues whatsoever. I'll call your attention to the Q&A pane on your screen, the questions pane. You can use that to interact with us. No one but us here at Cutting Edge Information can see what you're typing in there, so feel free to use that to dialogue with us around any issue, whether it's related to the content or whether it has to do with the technical issues. But certainly, if you have comments or questions, please use that space. I'll invite questions throughout, but I want to make sure that if you are curious about anything, you use that to talk with us. We may not be able to directly respond to every comment, but no matter what, we'll follow up with you after the fact, even if we don't talk about your question or get to your comment during today's proceedings. A couple of other points. One, you'll get a recording of the whole webinar. Everyone always wants to know about that, so you will get an email with links to things. And when we're done, please take a second to fill out the short evaluation that will pop up right on your screen when things end. We really do value what you have to say. Okay, all right, let's get into it. So today we're focused on tiering. Over the last year or so, we've been really focused on uncovering some of the commonalities in the tiering approaches of different organizations. And obviously, it connects back to the fair market value work that is Cutting Edge's bread and butter. But today we're going to dive into these tiering areas. We're going to look at challenges, obstacles, and we'll cover several of the more important takeaways that we have observed across the industry. So quick intro. These are the folks you'll be hearing from today. That's me on the left. I'm Eric. You'll also be hearing from Jacob Presson, who's a manager on our FMV side. And we've both been here at Cutting Edge for several years now as our FMV methodology has evolved. And for both Jacob and me, our work bridges the gap between the efforts of our internal data scientists and the work of clients like you all as you set up and deploy your FMV rates. So we try to unite those two worlds in the best way we know how. Here's what we'll be getting into today. First off, as always, for those of you who have been to these webinars, and I know we have a lot of repeat attendees in the audience, we'll get into the research methodology really quickly just to make sure that everyone is level set around how we approach what we do and make sure that we're on the same page. Then we'll get into some of the basic principles of tiering. We'll look at different approaches that organizations are using. We'll dive into key criteria. So what are the parameters that are being used in a lot of the tiering setups that we've observed? And then we'll touch on some trends before wrapping up and diving headfirst into the Q&A portion. So first off, we'll start with the methodology. And I'll hit this pretty quickly. I know a lot of you are familiar with this, but to get everyone on the same page, let's dig into where our FMV data come from. So many of you know exactly who we are, but we've been around since '02. For the last several years now, we've been solely focused on issues of fair market value compensation and HCP engagement. And we do that for markets around the globe. So we're looking at all kinds of different types of HCPs, different types of organizations, and then different affiliate markets around the world. We run an annual data collection initiative, and I know many of you take part in that. And that data collection initiative involves surveys as well as the gathering of actual rate cards. So we're looking at the rate cards that are in place at different organizations. And at this point, we've collected hundreds of thousands of data points around fair market value rates. So the rates being used to underpin engagement fees and contracts for different types of activities with HCPs and non-HCPs. We annually put all that data through a model that incorporates a host of market and economic factors to produce our hourly FMV rates. And of course, that's our product, hourly FMV rates, for more than 160 different types of physician specialists and allied health professionals and so on. But the topics we'll be discussing today, tiering, they're of course directly connected to this process, but they operate a little bit in parallel. But because we're helping clients with their FMV rates, we encounter all of these challenges that come up and all the questions that organizations tend to have when they're looking at their FMV systems and their HCP engagement systems. And that's where a lot of our information today will be coming from, those conversations and those interactions with our clients. All right, so let's jump right in. I'm going to hand things off to Jacob in a moment, but the first of our main sections does focus on tiering basics, and the main points here revolve around, or tend to revolve around, things like consistency, as well as the criteria for managing different types of thought leaders with whom you may be engaging. And before I hand things over to Jacob, I'm going to jump into the first of a couple of polls that we have for you here today. I think we just have a couple, but this is the first one. And the question is, and it should pop up on the screen here in just a moment, but it's how satisfied are you with your current approach to tiering? So this is a pretty subjective question, but as you think about your tiering process, are you very satisfied or moderately satisfied? Or would you like to improve? You're not satisfied. And of course, there are those of us who maybe don't know or don't have a firm hold on exactly how we feel about the tiering process. So as always here, we'll let some of these answers come in. I see they're still bouncing around a little bit. And Jacob, when you see things settling out, feel free to jump right in.
Sure, and I'll just echo Eric's thanks for everybody joining us here today. So, I mean, when I look at these results, moderately satisfied being the most popular choice, it kind of checks out and it resonates with what we're hoping to talk about today, which is that there are some parts of tiering that may appear relatively straightforward, that can be easy to implement, but there are some real challenges, and hopefully what we provide folks today is some answers to those challenges, or at least some new perspectives with which they can approach those challenges. And for those, for the 12% of you who are very satisfied, we certainly would welcome your comments and feedback throughout the presentation. If you think there's something we've missed, feel free to chime in. As interactive as this webinar can be, we would love for that to be the case.
All right, we'll move this poll out of the way here and jump right into the first area here.
Awesome. And so in his introduction, Eric did mention that we do kind of ongoing research with our clients just to make sure that we keep in touch with their needs, with their challenges. And so part of what I'm going to be presenting today is the results of a survey we ran earlier this year. We asked several questions about tiering, and one of the first things that we wanted to examine was the importance of keeping tiering separate from commercial functions. Around 85% of our respondents did agree with that statement, citing the need to keep tiering objective and medically driven. But what does that actually mean in practice? So first, it means making sure that the entire FMV process as a whole is kept distinct from commercial teams. It's also important that that the criteria that you're considering when you're tiering an HCP are completely unrelated to any marketing or commercial goals or objectives. And that actually leads us to the next point. The process by which you examine an HCP's qualifications really needs to be kept as consistent as possible. And that includes the criteria by which you are assessing them. We'll talk later about the various ways of tackling this assessment, but the main point for now is that it needs to be consistent across all HCPs of the same type. But with that being said, it's really important to acknowledge that not all KOLs are the same. Your approach to tiering should take this into account. Applying the same tiering process to a nurse that you use for a specialist just for the sake of consistency is like comparing apples and oranges, and you're not going to get useful or substantive outputs from that. Now, increasingly, we see companies adopt separate tracks for non-specialists, kind of like the nurse I just mentioned. So this might be useful if you tier other non-MD healthcare providers like pharmacists, or if you tier PhDs or other professionals that may be tangentially involved in the healthcare process. One of the most common questions that we encounter in tiering is the matter of patient tiering. Right now, we see two divergent approaches, and there doesn't appear to be an industry consensus yet. I promise I'll touch more on this topic later, but first I'll hand things back over to Eric to provide a seg into our next topic.
All right, thanks, Jacob. Yeah, okay, right. So tiering basics, consistency, identifying some of those key differences that we want to be aware of as we're setting up our tiering systems. As far as the actual organizational approaches go, in this section, we'll look at some of the pros and cons of different tiering systems. So the actual ways that we see organizations implementing their tiering setup. So this includes things like a pretty straightforward review of CVs, right up into scorecard systems that are more or less complex. I know Jacob will also touch on using third parties and what that means for the overall tiering approach, as well as a few other options.
Thanks, Eric. So one note before I dive into this next section. Throughout the presentation, we're referring to CVs or curriculum vitae. These are self-made documents summarizing an individual's accomplishments on a professional level as well as their background. Different countries might refer to these documents with various terms, but for the sake of consistency today, I'll be using CV or resume. And again, this is just a general term to describe that documentation of somebody's professional accomplishments. So going back to that survey I mentioned earlier, we asked respondents to identify, broadly speaking, how they approach tiering HCPs. Now, as things stand, around half the industry today currently tiers HCPs by having an assigned individual or team review the CV and then designate a tier. In second place, we found that around 25% of respondents use a scorecard or a point style system that's used alongside the CV review process. And that just helps the guide the person tiering through that process. 20% of those surveyed outsource the entire tiering process, and there's a couple of different reasons why you might want to do that. And the remaining 5% fell into one of a few other categories, including simply not tiering HCPs, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. Let's start off with the CV review process. So this is essentially the most stripped down approach. This is ideally going to be conducted by someone with significant knowledge of the healthcare provider landscape. It's sometimes done in conjunction with documentation on years of experience or other criteria to facilitate consistency. Now, one of the main complications with this approach is the potential subjectivity of decision-making for HCPs that fall kind of between tiers. So if we look at the table on the right, which is a relatively straightforward way to try and document the general ranges into which an HCP falls. Let's imagine an HCP with 15 years of clinical experience and 8 publications in the last 5 years. And so if we look at the table, those fall pretty neatly into the tier 1 category. But let's imagine that this same HCP doesn't hold any leadership positions within their organization and has only worked on 2 clinical trials within the past 5 years. Those criteria align more with tier 3 qualifications. And so this is not an insurmountable challenge by any means. Companies make these kinds of qualitative calls all the time, but what I'm trying to say here is that there are definite points of inconsistency or potential points of inconsistency. And that could be really problematic if you have a situation where 2 people look at the same resume or CV and give different tier designations. The nice thing about this approach is that companies are able to generate a tier designation relatively quickly, really only using the CV or any other document, comparable document that details their background and accomplishments. But in order for this to work, that individual has to have a deep knowledge of the relevant criteria for tiering, and more importantly, how an individual HCP fits into the broader medical landscape. This individual should be aware of the relative prestige of various institutions and publications, um, uh, to appropriately categorize the HCP's background. I do see that we've gotten in a question from the audience, and I want to make sure that we address this. So it's a question about where the data I'm talking about comes from. So this was a survey that we distributed to both clients and other contacts that we have within the industry, similar to the survey that Eric talked about that we use to collect FMV data itself. And so the data is collected worldwide. We had about 45 respondents this year from a good range of company sizes as well as geographic locations. As with a lot of the research that we do on the industry, was primarily able to collect data from the US and Europe, although we did get some from other markets. And if you have questions about data that's specific to your market, absolutely feel free to ping that in the chat, and we will do our best to get back to you either here today, or we'll make sure to follow up via email. So going on from CV review, we talked about the scorecard approach, and what I'm showing here is a simplified version of what a scorecard might look like. As you can see, even if it accounted for a longer list of criteria, the card is relatively straightforward. And this also helps resolve the issue identified with the previous approach. We don't have the same level of ambiguity for edge cases. If we take that same individual from the last slide, somebody with 15 years of experience, 8 publications, 2 clinical trials, and no leadership positions, we can just tally up the points. That's 6 points for their experience, 3 points for the publications, 1 for their position in the hospital as a physician, and 2 points for their trial management. We get 12 points. And we have an individual who is just a lower end tier 1, which is about what we might expect. And again, this slide shows a simplified version of this approach. But if you take this, you can really facilitate consistency and encourage objectivity in your tiering assessments. On the downside, though, this does take a lot of upfront work and knowledge to be able to put something like this together. And accounting for various third-party backgrounds can be difficult. You almost need a scorecard for the different types of HCPs or professionals that we talked about earlier. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a significant number of companies choose to outsource their tiering entirely. This could be very helpful to ensure that the tiering is always completely independent from other considerations within your organization. And we do see companies pursue this if they are particularly conservative from a compliance perspective. Their risk tolerance is very low. Completely outsourcing tiering can be a useful way to ensure objectivity and consistency and keeping the process separate. On the downside, it can be a little bit of a black box. Different vendors will provide you with different degrees of detail on why they provide a specific tiering, and the documentation may not always be as robust. Now, let's talk about what I've kind of jokingly here called the rogue option. This is electing to forego the tiering conversation altogether and simply not tier third parties at all. This does have some potential applications, specifically for non-specialists or other titles with whom you don't frequently engage, or where there's minimal differentiation within the professional landscapes. That would apply to patients, for example, if you wanted to do that. And making this call can really reduce some headaches around tiering, but I have to say it's not really an industry standard approach, especially for specialists or highly qualified HCPs. And if you were to try this approach with those types of individuals, you run a significant risk of under or overpaying those HCPs.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jacob. Okay, so that's a good rundown. It's definitely a good summary of the different kinds of systems that we see. And of course, there are endless variations. I want to emphasize that. So, everything in the end comes down to details, and we see a lot of different kinds of approaches. But those are the big buckets that we tend to I see, especially when we're going through these rate cards. Let's move into some of the key criteria that we see as part of these systems. So in this section, Jacob is going to walk us through the different parameters, the different criteria that we see used for tiering different types of physicians and non-physicians for that matter. So this would include all the traditional HCPs that we think of, the medical specialists and physicians, but it also includes non-MDs who are gaining in prominence. And frankly, that's where we often get a lot of our questions, especially as companies are trying to make sense of how to fit these individuals into their tiering systems, and then of course, how to compensate them in a way that's compliant, but also competitive with what those individuals are perceiving to be the case in their marketplaces. And then, as Jacob alluded to before, we'll also take a look at patients for whom tiering is very much an evolving landscape. So it's an area that is in flux.
Thanks so much, Eric. So, going back to that survey, this was one of the biggest topics that we tackled. Excuse me. We wanted to make sure that we had a good understanding of what kinds of criteria are relevant to the industry when tiering HCPs. The most significant results were focused on professional qualifications and experience, specifically when we're talking about specialists or MDs. So when we talk about experience, we're also looking at other knowledge or skill validators. Now, these two categories, they cover things like years of clinical experience, board certification, journal contributions, special certifications, among many other things. These categories are considered the two most important types of criteria by 60% of the industry. Now, certainly lots of other criteria do come into play. We saw companies that focus on industry-focused activities and scope of influence. Now, some respondents have indicated that history of industry activities can be tough to track down if you're looking at something like number of advisory boards or industry-specific speeches. And so as a result, not everybody considers this for tiering. Scope of influence is certainly a useful metric in principle, but it can be really hard to nail down. As a result, we see some companies prefer to use proxies for influence found in the first two categories. Like, for example, are they a journal editor? And you do that instead of attempting to directly determine the HCP's influence. Now, when we're talking about non-MD HCPs, so these would be the pharmacists, the nurses I mentioned earlier, you have less to work with when it comes to the CV review process, and it can be difficult to track details down. So as a result, many companies focus primarily on strictly professional qualification, years of experience, prestige of institution, as well as any documented speaking experience, like conferences or trainings that are going to be a good indication of how skilled this individual will be at the task you are putting in front of them. So, just like Eric mentioned, tiering for patients is very much in flux. The first approach that we see is somewhat similar to how HCPs and other professionals are tiering. They attempt to quantify and or document the patient's influence and expertise, and then they tier them accordingly. But this can be very challenging, especially in determining what metrics are relevant. So for example, should the number of followers they have on social media really matter? The second approach might be familiar to those of you with a market research background. Instead of tiering by influence, this model focuses on the availability of the desired individual and then tiers primarily based on that. So a patient who experienced a rare bone cancer would receive a higher tier than a patient who received the flu. Now, there's an additional complication with patient tiering, or even patient FMV in general. And this is the potential for what I call dual role individuals. And what I mean by that is somebody who you are engaging because they are a patient, but you might also, let's say, if they are a surgeon, you might have a different FMV for that individual. Um, and so that certainly complicates it certainly complicates the process. But it's I really there's even that surgeon should be paid a general patient rate. And that's regardless of their potential FMV earnings as a surgeon, because you're bringing them in to talk about their experience as a patient. Now, some of you in the audience might be wondering, wait, why are we even talking about tiering patients? And that's a completely fair question. We do have several clients who choose not to tier patients and instead pay all patients the same rate. But we are finding that over time, companies are finding a need to tier patients and differentiate between them. So this is a space that I expect to continue to evolve over the next few years.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jacob. All right. Well, here's the last big section that we actually want to cover today. And here we want to take a crack at answering some of the questions that come up when clients talk with us about their tiering systems. So there are a lot of different pain points that we tend to see. Things like which of these approaches is the most common? So what tends to be a fairly common or relatively standard approach to tiering? We get questions that dance around the topic of how different tiers are utilized. So you know, your international right down to your local thought leaders. So how do those different groupings get used, and what's most common? And we also talk a fair amount about how globally harmonized different companies' tiering approaches tend to be. So what level of international integration or at least coordination exists as HCPs from different affiliates are going through the tiering process. So Jacob's going to dive into some of these types of questions and talk about what we've been seeing.
Thanks again, Eric. So we talked about the scorecard approach to tiering earlier, and before we conclude, I do want to mention that based on what we're seeing, they are growing in popularity. And, you know, as with many things in the pharmaceutical industry, these things tend to spread almost via osmosis as individuals and organizations pick up and refine ideas over time. But we are seeing more companies adopt variations of this approach, largely due to how they facilitate consistency throughout the tiering process. Now, taking a step back from the specifics of implementation and the process, I wanted to take a look at how these tiers are being utilized around the industry. So at CEI, we publish rates in 4 tiers, a global or top tier, and then tier 1, 2, and 3 that are more account for varying degrees of influence and expertise on the national or local level. And so, based on the survey that we ran this year, we see around 5 to 10% of the HCPs being tiered fall into the global category, then 45 to 50% in tier 1, and 25 to 30% in tier 2, obviously, with the remainder falling into tier 3. Now, this might actually be useful to benchmark your own tiering against. If your process is outputting a significantly higher number of global or tier 1 HCPs, you might want to look at refining your approach accordingly. Now, I will say these numbers do vary by company, as HCP engagement strategies are certainly not all the same. But if you see significant variations, it might be worth at least taking a look. Now, I have to note, in our question, we specifically asked about the percentage of HCPs being tiered. In the past, we've seen that if we reframe the question to ask what percentage of engagements are conducted with HCPs of each tier, you do tend to end up with a slightly larger emphasis on global and tier 1 individuals. So I do just want to emphasize that slight little bit of nuance there. Also, in our survey, we asked respondents we asked them to share their thoughts on applying the same tiering system and criteria worldwide. And we did see that this concept does have broad support, but there are significant hurdles to implementation. Not all companies are integrated on a global scale, or at least integrated specifically with regards to HCP engagements, such that it would allow this type of worldwide coordination. In addition, while the appeal of a globally consistent process is strong, there are still open questions about the feasibility of the approach. Is it realistic to try and apply the same approach in Kenya or Vietnam that you apply in the US or large European markets? And that's an open question. Now, normally for those of you who have attended a couple of our webinars, we provide an update on how the industry is responding to COVID. But I'll be frank, certainly here at CEI, we've spent almost too much time talking about COVID, and it's dominated every aspect of our lives. So given that we're just a couple of days away from Halloween here in the US, I've got a quick poll question. Just asking everybody what your Halloween plans are, and then I'll hand things over to Eric to close out. So what are you going to be doing this weekend? Are your kids out trick-or-treating? Are you yourself going to be trick-or-treating? Are you just going to be doing your best to stay in and avoid everybody out on the streets? Is it possible that Halloween is a foreign concept and you just don't understand what these Americans are getting up to every year? Or is a certain part of you somewhat jealous about the activity? I'll be honest with everybody. I grew up outside of the U.S. And I have never understood what the big deal is about Halloween. So I am going to be casting my vote here for number 4, even though I am in the U.S. right now. I've never understood it. It seems like, given our COVID time, most folks are staying in and avoiding the trick-or-treaters, but some folks are actually sending their kids out, and that's really exciting. I hope everybody's able to do it safely. Eric, you've actually got family. What are your plans?
We are, Jacob, thank you for asking. I was almost about to end the webinar when you said you didn't understand Halloween, but I will allow it to continue. We're doing a very limited trick-or-treating, just a few local friends and family that are in our bubble. And I was thinking perhaps the more interesting tiering webinar would be around the different types of candy we all get. Are candy bars tier 1? Lollipops maybe tier 3 for me. I think this is the kind of hard-hitting data we need.
Yeah, and Kit Kats are a global tier candy.
There you go. That's right. Okay, thank you, Jacob. Yeah, as Jacob alluded to, we're here close to the end of things. I do want to wrap things up a little bit, and then we'll jump into some of the questions that have been coming in. And on that score, please use that Q&A pane if there's anything that's popped into your head, or if there's anything that you're curious about. We have a number of different comments and things to address, but keep it coming. and we'll get to everything that we can get to. So first off, let's touch on some of the key takeaways from all the things that we've talked about here today. First off, the basics. Not all HCPs and thought leaders are the same, as we know. So make sure, or the recommendation, of course, is to make sure that we're positioned to handle different types of individuals appropriately, different types of specialists, different NPs, the patients, even payers, or some of these other individuals who we may think of as executives, but who step into our compensation setups and our tiering schemes as needed. So the bottom line there is know how you'll differentiate going in, ideally, as opposed to trying to figure it out on the fly. Secondly, in terms of tiering approaches, be aware of the options available. Decisions should be driven by what allows you to get the most consistent and objective tiering possible. And that may mean changing how you're approaching things, or maybe setting up alternative approaches for some of these non-MD specialists and so on. And lastly, let's go back to Jacob's point on tier utilization and the emphasis on tiering different types of thought leaders. And on this point, it made me realize that when you're actually tiering, the distribution should be making sense across your HCP. So if you have a tiering system that's throwing out a disproportionate percentage of really top tier individuals, or maybe on the other end, folks tend to be tiered a little bit too low, then of course you're in a position where you may want to reevaluate a little bit. Okay, all right. This is the last real slide here. We'll dive into questions, but please, I'll say it right now, please remember to fill out the evaluation that will pop up on your screen when our production team here ends the actual slideshow. So it'll go right on your screen. We really do pay attention to your feedback. It actually means a great deal to us. So if you could fill that out, that would be fantastic. We do still have some events coming up, though this is our final webinar of 2020. So we'll be at a couple of the regular conferences that are going virtual this year. And for that December program there at the bottom of the screen in the light blue, let us know if you'd like to go and if a discount would come in handy, because we can help you with that. Okay, let's start to sift through some of these questions. All right, Jacob, I'm going to start lobbing these at you. Going back to the US versus OUS and the global harmonization points, the question is, how does tiering change outside of the major markets? That's one variation. Another variation is, how does it change US to OUS? So, but they're all getting at kind of the same thing. So as you're looking across borders, or you have systems that are trying to account for some of the idiosyncrasies of different markets, how do you manage that comprehensively?
Yeah, and this is a question that we do get from clients as well. And to be transparent, it is something that we're still fully exploring. But in general, what I would say is that, if you go back to when we were talking, excuse me, about the CV review process and the importance of having somebody who understands the professional landscape and understands what criteria are important that might set an HCP apart from his or her peers. It's important that anytime you try to roll out a tiering system in a new market, you at least run it through one or more individuals with that kind of expertise. And that's going to be a good reality check for you to say, all right, we want to put this in play in country X. Will that actually work here? And so I think that's important. But one other thing that I would say there, just stepping back, is that, the process should generally be able to stay consistent across markets. And so you might find that in the Middle East, you look at different criteria, or you weight different qualifications differently, but the overall process, the means by which you go from a CV to a tier designation, should remain as consistent as possible.
Okay, thanks, Jacob. And I'll add a little something to that. This is entirely a coincidence with this question, and then that first conference that's up on screen in the dark blue. So I'm doing a panel on FMV um, at the Pharmaceutical and Medical Device Congress. And I know one of the things we'll be talking about on the tiering front is the impact of the pandemic on cross-border engagements. And so as organizations get more comfortable or realize that that travel isn't involved with the engagements, many of the engagements that are going on right now, that you can start to look to some of these thought leaders who maybe weren't in play for you for a particular event. But when it's virtual, as I think as many of us have discovered, it kind of doesn't matter where you are. But of course, if you are looking to a broader pool of speakers or ad board participants or what have you, then all of a sudden you're in a situation where that harmonization point and that local sensitivity point maybe be a little bit more relevant or maybe a little bit more relevant for you than they were for past programs. So this kind of stuff is continuing to evolve. And we may see a situation here where more organizations get comfortable looking across borders, looking across regions and systems to at least have a better sense of what's going on with the approaches in different countries. Um, Another question here. So this is more of a nuts and bolts question, Jacob. So who, in your eyes, who is actually managing the tiering um, organizationally? So at a function level, and maybe that can be we can split that into sort of global approaches and then country by country approaches. And you kind of touched on it, but do we have a sense of who's doing it?
Sure. So by and large, the process is most of the time, I would say,
Mhm.
being managed by medical affairs, largely because that is where you find the individuals who have the necessary expertise and knowledge of the professional landscape to accurately tier an individual. But that's certainly not a blanket rule. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of reasons why some companies choose to outsource the tiering process entirely. There could be, as I mentioned, conservative compliance cultures where they want to keep that completely separate. In some cases, compliance, because it's separate from medical affairs and HCP engagement teams as a whole, we do see that sometimes that ends up being heavily involved in the tiering process. But I would say the general rule of thumb is that medical affairs either manages or has a significant role in the HCP tiering process.
Okay. Okay. And here's a question. So this is a question that sort of takes a half step away from tiering specifically, but also addresses the fair market value hourly rates, that we spend so much of our time on. And the question in a nutshell is, do we see pushback from the thought leaders around FMV rates? So on the ground, are we hearing about pushback there? Do we think, or have we observed that our rates are generally well accepted and so on among the actual HCPs, so the people who are on the other sides of the contracts? And Jacob, I have some thoughts on that. Do you want to take a stab at it first?
Sure, yeah, I'll weigh in. So when any time you're deploying rates, I think you'd be hard pressed to find any supplier of FMV rates who can confidently say that they've never had pushback. That is to an extent just the nature of the landscape, and that's almost what you would expect because HCPs are going to be negotiating. Um, they're going to be interested in making sure that they are getting paid what they feel they are worth. And so that certainly is kind of part of almost any deployment. But what I will say, and one of the advantages of our approach to FMV is because we collect market data on the ground, a lot of times if we do get that kind of pushback, we're able to walk the client through the data that we collected and help them understand what we saw on the ground and give them that little extra bit of confidence that what they are paying really does reflect, or what they are offering rather really does reflect the industry standard for what that HCP should earn. And that gives them a powerful tool to go back to the HCP and say, hey, listen, I know that you might want more, but we have strong, well-backed data that tells us that that this rate is appropriate for this kind of engagement.
Yeah, and I would add that it really does seem to be case by case for us, and it comes down to the organization and how they're approaching these contracts, and also the perceptions of the HCPs in that market. And the example that I like to point to is a lot of times with all of the different rates we provide, and because we provide them in percentiles, and let's say at the higher end we have the 75th percentile, and the lower end we have the 25th percentile. For the same market and the same specialists, we may have one of our clients say, well, this lower percentile, let's say the 45th or 50th percentile, is actually too high. And then in the same breath, another client will say that a higher percentile is too low. So I think there's a lot of different experiences out there. I will point out that when we're talking about hourly rates, that's one thing. But then when you go through the whole engagement fee process and you're including things like prep, like travel, back when anybody used to travel, that companies do have different approaches to those different components, and that can lead to some different numbers in the end. And of course, the HCPs are often not in a position to really understand how those numbers come together. So it's a real devil in the details type of situation. There's a related question to this, which is, do we see companies offering different types of rates, or different rates rather, based on the type of activity? So we might think about speaker programs versus involvement on panels, or versus taking a role on an ad board, whether that's being a member of the ad board or perhaps chairing the ad board. So Jacob, what do we see there?
So by and large, we see that the base hourly rate does not tend to change a lot between activities. So the same hourly rate is generally paid for consulting or speaking or participating in an advisory board. But where you get the big differentiation is in the calculation of prep time, or maybe premiums for leading an advisory board. And so if you're simply moderating a speech or a panel, your prep time probably won't be as much as if you're spending that hour giving a full speech. And so the base hourly rate does not generally change, but the total compensation amount should reflect the variations in the number of hours required of the HCP. It's a similar thing for advisory board chairpersons. What we often see today is that they receive a premium, not a higher hourly rate necessarily, but just a single, generally equivalent to 1 or 2 hours of work, and that is their premium and recognition of their work, and in recognition of their work chairing the advisory board.
Okay, thanks, Jacob. Yeah, and I would emphasize, and Jacob, push back on me if you think I'm going a little bit too far here. But when you say that things are what we tend to see, and what we see companies tending to do, it's not as though those other approaches are wrong, or out of the compliance spectrum. It's just that things have pointed in a certain direction, especially over the last 3, 4, 5 years. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think that's certainly fair.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I don't want to raise any too many alarm bells or red flags. And of course, if you do have any questions about any of this, please follow up with this, with us rather, and we'd be happy to talk more with you about it. Got time for a couple of more questions here. One is going back to the NPs and PAs, so what some people call advanced practice providers, or APPs. So how do people differentiate, or how do companies differentiate among them? And I can jump in here. This is definitely an area of relatively intense scrutiny as far as rate setting goes. So, a lot of organizations tend to have a fairly solid handle on their MD specialists and so on, but especially with changing reporting requirements and just changes in the field in terms of who may be used for different types of engagements, we see a lot of focus on NPs, on PAs, and some other allied health professionals. And there are different approaches there. So as far as tiering goes, so we'll bring it back to tiering. One thing we do see is that tiering can be used to recognize specialist or specialized NPs or specialized PAs. And so within your tiering structure, you may recognize that there are quote unquote baseline NPs, let's say, and then there are the NPs who are operating in your space. So these are the NPs that are most relevant to your portfolio and your events. Um, and we do see companies using their tiering and rate setting systems to ensure that they're recognizing the importance of those folks. So you may actually, within your NP tiering system, you may tier them a little bit higher. So you have your baseline NP is, let's say, a tier 3 or tier 2. And then within your NP tiering, maybe you're tiering a specialized NP at tier 2 or tier 1. Now, hand in hand with that, you could do that. You could also simply be setting your rate at a higher percentile for those individuals. So if you're paying baseline NPs at the median or 50th percentile, maybe your specialized NPs are being paid at the 65th or 75th percentile. And all of that is entirely defensible. But we see variations on those kinds of solutions, and some of them are pretty clever, pretty smart, but entirely defensible as far as recognizing the differences among some of these increasingly differentiated folks in the APP space. Let's do one last question. Right, Jacob, here's a good one. This is one that we tackle a lot as we're helping clients with their rate cards or reviewing how they're doing things. So when do you recommend applying an hourly rate versus an activity rate? And the comment that comes along with this one is we find ex-US countries use daily and activity rates and not hourly rates. So we're talking about sort of the flatter fees or the daily rates as opposed to implementing an hourly rate. And I think there's a lot of nuance here, even when we talk about it and we talk about how we set up our rates. But what's your immediate response to that?
Sure. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, it is certainly important to make sure that however you deploy rates, it's in a way that the end users can easily understand and easily apply whenever necessary. But taking a step back, even when you talk about full activity rates or daily rates, all of those at their core still have some assumptions baked in terms of the number of hours, um, in terms of the number of hours that they expect the HCP to spend. And if you don't have that justification and you just have a general activity or daily rate, you might want to have that documentation, because otherwise it might look like a number without backing. And so generally, and this is part of why CEI only publishes hourly rates, is because we do know that companies have different assumptions, different best practices for how they assess prep time, how they assess the different premiums for various roles that an individual might take. But one of the things that we work through, and Eric, like Eric mentioned, we work through this with a lot of our clients, is we start with that hourly rate and we make sure that we're on firm ground there. Once we have that, then we can, in the markets that need it, build out a rate card of activity or daily rates that reflects good best practices for the prep time or other associated compensation amounts. And that way you have a complete, robust, and hopefully transparent system where you can point down all the way to the core data point from which you derived the full FMV rate.
Thanks, Jacob. Okay, and I'm going to take us out here. There is one final point I want to address, but I know the hour is approaching and I want to give everybody a chance to fill out those evaluations. But there is a quick question, it's near and dear to my heart, to our hearts, which is how does a company transition from one FMV provider to another? What kind of justification is reasonable? Um, we've gone through a lot of these transitions. We believe obviously very, very, very strongly in our market-based approach to fair market value, but we try not to pretend that we're holier than anybody else. But we do a lot of these transitions. Usually, what it comes down to is a case of reviewing different rates for different types of specialists, talking through where some of the greatest disruptions will lie, and we'll often run an analysis on a company's current rates and compare it to where we would set rates. And usually there's a pretty smooth runway for transitioning to a different set of rates that makes it not too jarring internally and not too jarring externally with the HCPs themselves. But the person who asked that question, you know who you are, and we'll follow up with you on it too, because it is a really good one. Those transitions can be tricky sometimes, especially country by country. Okay, all right, I'm going to sign off here. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it. Have a great Halloween. Be safe, be healthy, and of course, if you can, please fill out the evaluation that's going to pop up on your screen here in a minute. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks so much, everybody. Bye bye.